Which paradigm of the mind is most dominant? Who cares who owns the mind? Everyone, whether we admit it or not. Those who define the mind and the causes of its perturbations and cures become arbiters of truth, definers of normality and disorder, dictators of treatment goals and methods, and possibly sources of inspiration. That's good.
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to use that somewhere as a quote.
Can you see it on a PowerPoint slide? I was just at the American Psychiatric Association meeting, which was in San Francisco, and the most fun part was when I left. I skipped a day of the morning of the convention, and I went up to North Beach, which is my old haunts. I used to be a bicycle messenger back in the day in the 1970s. I dropped out of college and said I was never going to go back, and so I tried to make a living doing various things, including working for Speedy's delivery service. So I used to hang out in North Beach with other would-be writers and so on. But I was in San Francisco in the day, in the 70s. I was like the haight-ashbury, it was like it was the trailing end. The people were kind of, the thrill was gone, but this was still kind of in the atmosphere. And I actually, when I went to medical school at Stanford, which I didn't even know at the time, but a lot of the later research had been done at Stanford, and when 1970, when the Controlled Substances Act went through, all the research basically stopped.
Right?
And so when I was in medical school, they talked a lot about serotonin, but there was like no, it became like a buried history. So that was
psychedelics all of a sudden didn't exist.
It was just a non-topic. So it was just a funny thing to sort of go back to the center of it all, and
so it's funny that you say that, because I was now 2 decades later in late 80s, right after the Velvet Revolution in Prague, I came and I hitchhiked all over the United States.
Oh, wow.
And I also get a job. I was doing also jobs, including just a bartender.
Oh, wow.
On Sutter Street.
Oh,
and
we could have crossed paths, but I was there a decade earlier.
Right. Yeah. And I would work at nights, and then during the day I would just hang out at the Psychedelics bookstore.
Oh, that's so
and just read all the beat books, and of course the Vesuvio bar across the street.
Yeah.
Right, that was
funny.
the beat. Because when I was 17, I read On the Road, and I grew up in Europe, so that changed my life. My mission number one was I'm going to go to America and I'm going to hitchhike.
Wow.
But it was in the 80s when whoever picked me up would say, yeah, you cannot do that anymore here.
Right,
It was in Europe. It was normal at the time. That's
so when you came back from your hitchhiking and whatever, did you go back to college?
So it was actually before I said it wrong. So it was 1989.
Okay.
And I hitchhiked all over, which was a phenomenal time, including California and San Francisco. And then I had a friend in Arizona and Tucson, good places, and they were telling me, stay, but I just felt something was pulling me back, so I hitchhiked back to New York, and I took a flight and went back to Prague. I was late for classes and all this. I was in college, and 2 month later, or a month and a half later, the Velvet Revolution erupted.
Wow.
On campus.
Were you there at that time?
Yeah, we started it as.
Oh my God.
I was part of the student movement when. There was a demonstration. It was the excuse was a demonstration against the Nazi invasion. It was a Nazi anniversary, but the demonstration quickly turned against the communist government, and they beat us up and all that. And that, next day we went to the university and we went to professors and knocked on the doors and told them there would be no classes.
Wow.
So it was something. So and then the entire movement started, and Václav Havel, the playwright and artist, was a dissident and in jail, and 2 months later he was a president.
Wow.
So that was amazing.
So were you there that whole time?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that whole turn. When Havel became president, then what he decided to do is to have this interim government for 6 months. So January 1, he became a president, and revolution started in November And January 1, he was in jail and he became the president. And then he said, we're going to have 6 months of interim government, and every single member of the government was an artist.
Wow.
How
did that go?
I lived in a utopia.
So, I mean, it's just like another funny thing because, first of all, back in the day, another part of my California trip, because I also there must have been something in the air at that point, because, I mean, I was there in 74, 75, you were there like a decade later, but so I was supposed to meet a friend in San Francisco, and we were going to go hitchhiking down the coastal highway to LA, and then he got sick, he didn't show up, so I'm like, what can I do? So I just hitchhiked by myself, and I ended up on this kind of dusty road on Route 1, the coastal highway, got dropped off by my ride who went off into the hills somewhere, and I'm like turning the corner and all these like Hell's Angels are sitting on the edge of the road. I'm like, I'm not gonna keep walking because I don't want to go to the Hell's Angels. And so some guy pulls up in this little Dodge Dart, and turns out he was a school teacher who was going to a retreat at Esalen Institute, which was like 2 miles away. So I go into Esalen Institute, and there's a whole story, but I sort of sneak down the bush, through the bushes with this kooky guy who was bicycling to Mexico, or so he said. And we go into Esalen, and there's people in this beautiful pool on the edge of the, basically the western edge of the continent, and in these hot tubs, and everybody's tripping. It was like, what is going on? And I didn't have anything at that point, but it was a trip. To me, the trip was actually just going through,
seeing that.
It's like going through. First, I was in the redwoods, and then I was on the highway, and I couldn't find a ride, and the Hells Angels, and then I'm sneaking into Esalen Institute, and all these people are just stoned out of their mind, and then sitting in this hot tub, looking out of the Pacific Ocean while the sun went down. And anyway, it was just a really fun thing. And then I finally had to leave because the guy who I'd met sort of while we were going through the bushes, he was going to try to find a way to stay there. I'm like, I have to go on. The sun went down, so I climbed up the hill back to the highway, and the sun was up again. So then I watched the sun go down again. So it's just very psychedelic.
Yes.
And then finally I had my thumb out, and I get picked up by these Mexican guys who were, I think, landscapers or gardeners. They didn't have any room in the cab of their truck. So I lay down in the bed of the truck. I was freezing cold, and they're like zooming down the West Coast highway. And then they end up in, I was going to go to San Simeon, which is the Hearst Castle. So I go and end up at some cheap motel near Hearst Castle, and I get up the next morning and I walk up this long hill, and there's like zebras and antelopes, and it was literally like this. It was my living through psychedelics without having to take any
yes,
drugs.
Yes.
But flashback to that, to like, okay, here we are, literally 50 years later, because I'm not a teenager anymore, physically anyway. To me, because I was also presenting at the APA, American Psychiatric Association, I was presenting the little study that we did with psilocybin for body dysmorphic disorder. And so, it's like that's the therapeutic use, one of the, exploratory therapeutic use of psilocybin, and small study, but it worked for like 8 out of 12 people, and single dose within a week, everybody who was going to respond had responded.
That's published already?
It just came out last month. And we have MRIs. We haven't analyzed the MRIs. We haven't analyzed all the scales yet. But the efficacy, like the effectiveness of it, was quite good. And anybody who was better by basically week 1, and really probably the day after, pretty much stayed better for the whole 12 weeks. Except one person, the last 3-week period got worse again. The interesting thing of like psychedelics, besides the fact that they have this incredible history, is just like you can give 1 or 2 doses to somebody, and somehow long after the drug is out of the person's body and brain or whatever, it still has a lasting effect.
So there are 2 remarkable things, right? One is the rapid onset.
Right. Yeah.
It works fast, and then it lasts.
Yeah.
So it's really two amazing properties that
right, and I keep reading these sort of technical articles about the neurochemistry and the receptors, and I'm like, okay, I get it, it's on this receptor, and it's 5-HT2A receptor, but it's also 5-H2C, and you can tell me all the other receptors, but it's like, that doesn't explain how 1 or 2 doses has a lasting effect, because there's plenty of things that have effects on a ton of brain receptors, and they don't last that long.
That's right.
The other thing is I was last fall asked to be part of a meeting with an AMA committee. The American Medical Association has something called the CPT Code Committee. And the CPT Code Committee is what decides what number to give for a medical procedure. And so I went to this meeting, and suddenly they're talking about we need a CPT code for psychedelic treatment. And so they didn't approve it the first day, but I think we convinced them, so they had the second meeting, which was I think in January, February, and they finally approved it. It was just in the paper maybe a couple of weeks ago. But imagine like from 1970 when Nixon says like this is a class of drugs with no legitimate medical uses, it's Schedule 1, it's illegal, if you have it you're going to be put in jail. Fast forward 50 years, and the AMA, which is like one of the most conservative organizations, very not left-wing or progressive in that sense at all, and they're considering and then approving a CPT code for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And so it's like, wow, this is a historic thing. And then the other piece being that the really important piece is not just that they made the decision, but now insurance companies can decide to cover the treatment. So
that's the next big step, I think.
Oh, huge.
Huge, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, wow, this is, going from what are people, ingesting in this beautiful pool on the edge of Esalen Institute's lawn, and now 50 years later, it's like the hottest thing, and all the neuroscientists are like going nuts about it, and it's just this amazing historic moment.
It is amazing. What a return. What a return.
Yeah. And so,
and it's still illegal to possess it.
Well, and that's the weird thing too, is that the underground therapists, if you go to did you go to the Horizons meeting this year?
Yeah,
the conference?
Yeah. The last year,
Yeah. And so like, all these underground therapists are now, coming up, I say like mushrooms. They're coming up above ground, and like the Brooklyn, psychedelic therapist group or whatever.
Yep,
like,
it's everywhere.
You guys are doing something that's actually illegal. You could be, no, we have this network of this and that. It's like, okay, but it's Schedule 1. It hasn't changed from a federal regulation point of view. So tell me, what's the Ibogaine story? Like, why is that so cool?
Yeah, so interestingly, a few days ago or weeks ago, I finished participating in the documentary. It's a new documentary. Might be the first psychedelics-related film featured at Tribeca Film Festival.
Oh, wow.
I'll send you the link.
Okay.
So it has a title now. It's by Lucy Walker. She's a well-known documentarist. And it's called, the title is Of Night and Light, the story of Ibogaine and Ibogaine.
Wow.
And the story is, it reads really like a fiction or legend. It reads like a superhero story. You have all these superpowers, and because it really starts with the pygmies in the forest in Africa, knowing their secret medicine, and then they're sharing it with the other tribes. And then French colonialism.
Oh, wow.
And the French bring it to France. Locally, it's used for various ceremonial purposes. One of them is induction of death and rebirth experience for kind of a rite of passage procedure for adolescents.
Huh.
So pretty heavy,
wow.
Heavy stuff. So they bring it to Europe, then isolations and all that. It's actually sold in France as pills called lamberine.
Wow.
Small doses as a stimulant.
Wow.
Apparently it became very popular with Olympic athletes. So Olympic committee had to ban Ibogaine as a doping. So there are all this registry. And then it was sold in France until I believe 1960s or 70s, then discontinued. And then in New York City here, in our city here, this teenager in 1960s who was heavily addicted to heroin, he has a friend chemist who has in his freezer this exotic alkaloid. So he tries it. And he, very profound trip, and he wakes up and he's like, for the first time I didn't feel fear. And then he was like, wait a minute, it's been 24 or 30 hours and I don't feel any withdrawals.
Wow.
And then next day he didn't have withdrawals, and then a week he didn't have withdrawals. So he repeated the experiment with 5 of his friends, all dependent on heroin. And I think, I think all of them basically had the same effect. So it rapidly interrupts physical dependence. So now we're talking about physiological effect, right? By using for weeks and months and years an opioid, a drug, cellular responses, right? Biochemistry goes through adaptation.
Right. So
Right. So you're changing the actual biochemical pathways because you're constantly driving that opioid tone.
Right.
When you remove it, it goes into this overdrive of these compensations that normally take place. So it's a cellular physiological effect, and that's known that acute withdrawal symptoms are crushing, right? So you have
Right.
So he made that discovery, and then tried to he went to scientists and saying this is unheard of, this is a breakthrough, but nobody would listen for a long time. Wow. And finally, there's this group, a chemist in Vermont, Stan Glick, upstate actually, in Albany. And they picked it up and they started doing rat experiments and all that. And it replicated pretty well in preclinical studies that it shows some very interesting results. And then in the 1990s, it came to NIDA, which is the National Institute on Drug Addiction. So there was this big moment, will NIDA start funding the preclinical work? So the Glick's work was funded by NIDA for years, all these classical papers in rats and all that. And then it came the moment, when NIDA came together and they invited some pharma industry experts, and they were saying, okay, so are we going to go forward with this? And at that time, there were a few deaths that occurred. So now we know that Ibogaine induces QT interval prolongation in the heart. So it blocks this channel in the heart and disrupts the regular beat of the heart. So it's called arrhythmia. So
is that like a 5-HT2C effect, or is that?
No, it's through this ion channel, this potassium ion channel, and that's a well-known liability target for lots of drugs, and lots of drugs have it.
Right.
Cocaine also has these liabilities. So by itself, it's okay. It just increases the risk of arrhythmia, and then people with pre-existing conditions, or people traveling to Ibogaine clinic in Costa Rica and they're dehydrated, they're hypokalemic.
Right.
So all these things that led to that some people had arrhythmia and some people died. So they looked at this whole picture and they said, no, we're not going to do it. It's just too risky. So there are all these players in the story, where one of them is Deborah Mash, and she then set up a clinic. She was like, this is the only thing that works for addiction.
Oh, wow.
So, but that was heroic because now we have 191 subjects treated, published. It's still outside of, no placebo control, obviously, and all that. So it's what you would call, what would you call it? It's an open label.
Open study, open treatment study.
Open treatment.
Case series.
Yeah. And then you see it, you have subjective withdrawal scores, you have clinician-administered subjective scores, and you see these effect sizes it's just amazing. So both for opioids, and there were also a few cocaine addicts. So that data is there, and that's the strongest data. And then they were replicated by other smaller studies.
So fast forward, are you doing work in that area now?
Or then it lasts. So people then, the physical dependencies are disrupted, and then for about half of patients, roughly numbers based on these type of surveys, also lose craving, which is really remarkable. And some people just say, Ibogaine ruined drugs for me, because there's all of a sudden the cue-induced habit kind of behavior is reduced for some people, craving is reduced, and the physical dependence is not there. So, but then the question when I was reading about this and being just totally blown away as a scientist, this kind of miraculous African plant, it's like, how does that work? I mean,
same question.
Right, the same questions you're asking, we're asking in the field. How does it last so long with one treatment?
Right.
And then I read this paper in 2005. It showed that in rats, it induces GDNF, glial cell-derived neurotrophic factor, which is this growth factor, a protein that our brains make. Well, they show that it induces rapidly GDNF, and came up with the hypothesis. And then they did control, they injected GDNF into ventral tegmental area and other areas responsible for rewarding processes in addiction. And they saw, oh my God, when you inject GDNF, it actually rapidly resets the whole dopaminergic system. And she did it in drinking rats.
Wow.
And then I was like, Okay, so, and then we said, okay, we're going to reproduce it, and we reproduced it. And we also showed it induces BDNF and NGF, and we haven't looked farther to other growth factors, but it induces a bunch of these. Prefrontal cortex, VTA, GDNF and VTA.
So it's like,
So we had a hypothesis. So we have a hypothesis.
So are you looking at like variations of the drug that could?
Oh yeah, that's chemist.
So So I mean that's what you do.
Right. So when we looked at this, right, it's a molecule with remarkable clinical effects. It's a molecule with unknown mechanism of action.
Right.
A beautiful molecular structure. And a serious side effect. So it's like perfect for a chemist, right?
Yeah.
Because like we have things to fix, it's complex structure, so chemists will not be bored, and huge impact. So that really became the prism because of failures of psychiatry over decades to develop novel treatments.
It's like the anesthesia thing, which is the very short step between the drug effect and the mind. And you're working on things that are exactly that, and that's what I'm looking for, because psychiatry has been stuck.
Yeah.
And it was like when Vesalius, back in the history of medicine, came out with the anatomy of the human body. And so doctors who were practicing at that time, they reported that they would see the organs of their patients without x-rays, of course, but they could imagine the heart pumping, and they would see the pulses that were fluttering or whatever, but they could basically visualize the internal organs. And so that's what us clinical psychiatrists are doing in the age of neuroscience.
Yes, yeah.
We're starting to see this.
You're starting to see the gross patterns in gross.
In the big patterns. But then we're like, well, we're stuck with these treatments that really haven't advanced over the last maybe 25, 30 years. Like Prozac came out in 1988. That's like almost 40 years ago, 35 years ago. And so one of the amazing principles of neuroscience is the plasticity of the brain. And so it goes right to the, and here's these agents that were despised and made illegal and put in jail. And they're really weird agents because they seem to have effects on these different transmitter systems and nerve growth factors, and they have these rapid effects. You can't, you could say it's placebo, but I have never heard of a rat having a placebo effect. Maybe they do, I don't know.
I mean, there are some placebo-like effects in rodents, which is fascinating, but it's,
it's not the same.
No,
I stand corrected.
It's not the same.
And the other piece of, which gets back to the Ibogaine picture, is like all the other Schedule I drugs that I'm aware of, if you use cocaine, you're more likely to use heroin. If you use heroin, you're more likely to use marijuana. If you use, and they in other words, they enhance each other's use. And even alcohol, if you drink a lot of alcohol, here we are. I think
and the rate is pretty slow.
This rate is slow, so I'm not going to. I don't really want a cigarette. But if you drink a lot of alcohol, you want to smoke cigarettes, you want to use marijuana. But the psychedelics are one class that, if you use psychedelics, you actually use less of other drugs. So that's a really weird thing.
Yeah, it is.
They're categorized as illegal drugs because they're supposedly make you do horrible things or they have no use. But why would they? So why does Ibogaine do that? And it's just like, a heroin addiction is a very serious and difficult, like the only real treatments traditionally were like methadone, which was basically a maintenance replacement of the opiate. It's not, and so now we have some other drugs that try to help people, but they're really like buprenorphine and other kinds of blockers of partial blockers of opiate receptors. But this is like a different kind of thing. But it's not ready for prime time. That's the problem.
Well, like with other psychedelics and with Ibogaine, now we have the same trend that people are just not waiting for the mainstream healthcare, right? Which is another thing, which is of course concerning. But there are these people with, look at this: 100,000 people in America dies of drug overdose a year. It's just a tragedy. It's an epidemic. So it's 100,000 people.
That's incredible.
So that's twice the number of car accidents and things like that. And then, as you know, suicides and mental health and all that, and kind of the deaths of despair. Some people call it now deaths of the young and all that. So it's a serious problem. So So there are these clinics in Mexico and Costa Rica and Holland that, just set up this parallel healthcare system, right? And some of them are, crazy that you should never go to, but some of them are quite responsible and they're trying to do it like a real clinic. And so thousands of people have been and are treated for addiction. So it's happening. And another thing that's happening now, which is really, again, shows the times we're in, which are so fascinating, that the U.S. Special Operation Forces, veterans,
like the SEALs, Navy SEALs,
the hardcore, right? So
Yep.
And as a clinician, you would appreciate that those are possibly the most difficult to treat because you have neurological, TBI, traumatic brain injuries.
Right, they've been around exploding devices.
Things are exploding around them.
Injuries,
they have damaged brain. They have PTSD, so they have a trauma post-battle. Very often it's combined with childhood, trauma. There's also drug abuse, and so that's very complex. So I met this fellow who's a former SEAL who, the typical conversion story that you hear in psychedelics, but this is again, heartbreaking or heartwarming because he was basically going to kill himself. It was just at the end of the rope, severe PTSD. He couldn't go on, and his wife didn't know what to do. Heard about Ibogaine. He went to the clinic in Mexico, and it brought him back. So he started this foundation, which is called VETS, VETS Capitals, and they raise money, and they put the word out to collect applications from other veterans who are in a similar situation as he was. And he told me, he comes to Horizons, and I met him there
I met him too.
At the conference.
Yeah.
And so you know him, so you know the story.
We're talking to him too.
Yeah, so you're talking to him too. So, and he's inundated with applications, and then they screen them to make sure that they're legitimate. And then they also screen the Ibogaine clinics.
Right. Oh, interesting.
And then they give them, so when they screen and say this soldier, that's a real deal, he's a veteran, he's been injured, and then they give him a grant of $3,000 to $5,000 or something like that, and they ship them to the pre-screened Ibogaine clinic. So this is happening.
This is like the underground therapist.
That's right, underground. It's the
Except
underground
this is
therapist.
like to the nth degree because these are
right.
big people
That
who know a lot,
and they serve the country
Yeah.
in the most extreme way. And then now there's this paper that came out last year or 2021, which has approximately, I don't remember, but we were talking about 50 or so subjects. So 50 special operation veterans who were treated. And you look at these effects, it's like all these symptoms are going, huge. There's very large statistically significant effects. And now there's another paper came out this year when you have risky alcohol take plus PTSD. And again, you see reduced risky alcohol drinking for those who had PTSD. So this is happening. It's amazing. So these people, these foundations are lobbying state capitals to bring Ibogaine. I'm going back to your question, when is it a prime time? So I would agree with you and say no, but at the same time, you see the pressure and the need and lobbying, and it's just happening anyway. And now I think that's going to be a last piece that might be a turning point for Ibogaine, which is a study at Stanford. So you may know him or heard of him. His name is Nolan Williams.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so what he did, he scanned them before they went to Mexico. Again, PTSD, TBI in this case. And then they went to do the treatment. This treatment is even wilder because it's Ibogaine, day 1 or 2, and day 3 is 5-methoxy-DMT. So it's this integration of Ibogaine experience on 5-MeO-DMT.
So 5-MeO-DMT, if I can
we'll
just say
talk
a
about
word.
that too.
No, but it comes from toad venom.
Yes.
And it's the Sonoran desert toad, and my advice is never touch a Sonoran desert toad because they're endangered, and you will also have a very difficult experience. But it causes a very, very, my understanding is very intense, short, like 10-minute, 15-minute trip, and people see the beginning and end of the universe, and
it's
another life-changing
another special psychedelic, and we have a paper under review on its pharmacology, so we can talk about it too, because there's an interesting mechanistic twist. So that's the treatment, and what I haven't seen the data, but what I heard, because he talked about it at the conference. So apparently these soldiers, former soldiers, had severe neurological TBI or brain injury, and he scanned them. So he did functional magnetic resonance imaging of the brain before. Then they went to Mexico to get treated. They came back, and apparently it's just it's pretty amazing what they see. It's a small study.
Yeah.
But when that's published, I think that with the movie that I told you about, it might just be kind of a turning point.
So this is one of those, the cat is out of the bag.
Yeah, the cat is out of the bag,
and it's really, because I'm talking to these folks too, because we have a study we like to work with them on, and I think
with Ibogaine or with,
well,
if we can do Ibogaine, we need to talk.
We will talk. We're gonna have more conversations with more beer.
That's right. Because we need basic science on Ibogaine. We don't have basic
right. I think
human science. So and that's where Lila can come to the picture. Sorry for interrupting.
So there's what's interesting again to me is that, and this gets back to the sort of the neuroscience moment, is that there's a very short path between the clinical people and the lab people and the like Lila DeFacci is a very well-known professor at Columbia, and she does research on the hippocampus and memory.
In humans.
In human beings.
That's
right.
important, Human
biology. When I say someone does research, I always mean humans. But you have to make the distinction. You're talking about little humans that are about
I get little molecules and then the rats.
Yeah, I'm talking about big rats. But the point being, she does memory studies, and there's a lot of other researchers, like there's a social psychology researcher.
Yeah, she's
John
in psychology
Freeman,
department.
And these are people who do brain activity studies, looking at how memory is encoded and the social brain and different kinds of things. So these are things that look like it's not only that the circuit is changing, to make you feel less depressed or have less obsessive thoughts. Looks like there's something happening in the way the parts of the brain are communicating with each other, and access to memory. You can correct me, I'm probably saying this all wrong, but you're right
on
access
it.
to memory or emotional memory or social memory, and people, I think what we're realizing in psychiatry, people who have disorders of very different kinds, like the DSM was always like, oh, well, this is depression, this is PTSD, this is eating disorder, this is body dysmorphic disorder, this is OCD. So now we're saying, well, all these disorders have something in common. First of all, they often involve the same circuits, just different permutations and combinations. So there's not that many different circuits in the brain that have to do with emotional functioning and behavior, but they get stuck. And so OCD, addiction, eating disorders, depression, different drugs may work differently. Some of them might not work for this or that condition, but it looks like these drugs help people get unstuck. How? Right? But that there's some kind of reordering or reconnection of brain networks, and it's like something is happening very quickly, and it's on a level that we can't just say it's a clinical level, that's great, the symptoms are getting better. No, we have to actually understand fundamentally, well, what is going on?
Yeah,
because otherwise, how can you make progress?
Yeah.
But to me, it's like, wow, all these different disorders there seems to be an effect of the psychedelics on so many different kinds of disorders. What do they have in common, and what are the drugs doing? So, like with these vets, do they, does it affect their TBI too? Like,
well, if that
that would be a fascinating thing too.
Then you have actual physical damage to the brain that is being repaired, or alternative pathways are being created around it. Whatever.
Right.
Whatever
so is that even possible? It's just like a mind-blowing thing.
It's mind-blowing, and that goes to that interruption of physical dependence on drugs, because that is, I say real just jokingly, that is real molecular biochemical pathways that are being changed, that has to be reset or refixed. And of course, physiology, psychology are connected, but for scientific purposes, we separate them. So to some extent, it's successful. So the physical withdrawal symptoms could be characterized as physiological.
Yeah, no,
While the
right.
delayed withdrawal syndrome, which is depression, anxiety, is much more psychiatric looking, right?
Right.
Yeah. But no, it's there's something that's happening on a very fundamental level because, as you're saying, you see the transdiagnostic effect.
Right.
Because Ibogaine causes these incredible memory recall effects when people describe, in some cases, full kind of time travel in your own memory. So you have these holographic
Wow.
recalls when you have your memories on a TV screen or on a computer screen and you click, and all of a sudden you can get right into that memory and observe yourself as a third person. You can observe yourself as an actor in the movie, or you can relive. And there are these reports that when you read it, you just are thinking, this is now Star Trek taking place, And so we're really trying to do fundamental science, human science, with Ibogaine, and that's harder because of this cardiac. The safety is a different.
Could they be treated with some cardiac drug that would sort of affect?
Monitoring might be enough, so patient monitoring. So the level of safety is really a different order compared to psilocybin, for example, which we've been doing. So we would have to be careful, but it's doable. That there are thousands of people being treated. It's just we have to get an IND, the investigational new drug. That's the permission from government to do it safely on humans. But we have to do it because the memory recall effects, I call it a second consciousness, which is just the term I use to describe these experiences of other entities or intelligent entities that people describe on Ibogaine. I talk to these people who administer Ibogaine. So I talked to one person who has treated 350 patients.
Wow.
The memory recall is very common, apparently. And that it can go into this level of, interactive, immersive time travel. But then there's this, what I call second consciousness. So all of a sudden, some people describe, this is a kind of a higher level of experience, so it doesn't happen to everyone. All of a sudden, you have this entity, and people describe, now this entity is here, and I'm being scanned. So they're describing that something is scanning them. So I'm devising this nomenclature for this, so I call it the algorithm for second consciousness. So there's this other consciousness. So my very broad hypothesis that the primary consciousness, the biological one, through which we sense, feel, and see live and view our movie, is dampened or altered. And then the second one, through some bizarre algorithm, provided these reports will turn out to be true and reliable, as a second consciousness, which is capable of scanning our subconscious material. And it's tagging it. That's what they describe. And then the most salient personal issues are presented. And then they describe that second consciousness sets up this interface that communicates with the first one. So that could be a projection on a screen, it's a cartoon, and they're communicating these messages. And then there's another level of experience when they, particularly with drug-dependent people, and they say, and then they call it differently, right? In second consciousness, they call it the Iboga teacher or presence or spirit. They just turn into, I call it deep diagnosis mode, and they go into reset mode when they're describing, well, now there's this team and they're cleaning out my axons and throwing out stuff. And so they have this visual,
Wow.
So you imagine if this turned out to be true, so you actually have the neuroplasticity reset, reformatting happening, but you also have a communication of it through the interface, right? So they say, I saw, you have these allegories. So I saw a warehouse and all these boxes of my shit. So I just saw shit being thrown into this void.
Wow.
So I'm reading these reports, personal reformatting, self-forgiveness. Oh, there are these motifs from other psychedelics, but yet this memory recall and these type of experiences, when I read it, I'm just this could really be a technology, in quotes, on its own, right? Where you're reformatting, resetting neural circuits, and it's communicating to the subject what it's doing.
So this is, do you think this is different with Ibogaine versus other psychedelics? Or?
Well, you see some of this in other psychedelics, right?
Yeah.
Insights and things like this,
Yeah.
but I don't see this often, this kind of communication, and kind of the clear.
I mean, it's really such an interesting, I mean, I would like to see it to believe it.
Right, no, right, that's right. I'm just, right.
Yeah,
but it's a caveat is this is reports. And,
Right.
But they're not singular reports.
Right, you're describing themes and ways that people describe.
And this would be kind of the highest level of experience, which is not that common. And then the highest experiences where people describe, and indigenous groups apparently have used methods to induce these, where the messages are not about the individual, the subject, it's about the community. And I find that very inspiring.
So, but you're also interested in drugs that affect those receptors and don't cause.
Right.
So that to me
That's
would
the
be
other direction.
Cool. Right. So, but it's like, it would really be cool to do a study comparing a drug that affects the serotonin system in the exact or almost exact same way versus something like psilocybin or LSD, because that, and you'd try to blind people or whatever you could do to do a good study, but a drug that affects the receptor and it doesn't cause a trip, and a drug that affects the receptor and causes a trip, and I mean that would be such a cool study, because it could be just you give the drug that doesn't cause a trip, but if you just give it so strong, such a dose that they would have had a trip if the drug had that effect, but maybe it'll work just as well, versus no, you actually have to have the psychological experience, and is that a key component? Because if that's the case, to me that's super cool and just pushes our models in a cool way. If the drug that just has the receptor effect and doesn't cause a psychedelic trip, well then you've got, we can give it to people who would be at risk, and certainly be a lot easier to give a drug that's
not psychedelic.
That's not psychedelic, because you wouldn't have to have all the, like now we have 2 therapists in the room with a patient, or a therapist and assistant for 8 hours. The total number of therapy hours is like 25 or 30 hours. MDMA is like 40, 41 hours. It's a lot of expensive therapist time. So if you could do, so there's a lot of reasons we would want to have them both win if it's a horse race.
I'm a butterfly, taking my time. I'm a skeleton.